So they went along with that. They thought of the violence as being a deplorable, maybe necessary, perhaps it went too far, but on the whole they supported Hitler. And of course, once it was clear that the Nazis were really taking everything over, then people swung round to save their jobs. They joined it. So many joined the party in early 1933 just to save their jobs or their careers or their livelihood, that the party actually put a stop to membership in May 1933. It was being flooded out by far too many
So in a sense, it's a lesson on how people, well-educated people of culture, end up joining a movement like that just out of their, by default or because of their own self-interest, and all of a sudden you have a nation of poets and musicians turning into a totalitarian regime.
Well, yes, you see, on 7th of April 1933, the Nazis passed a law saying any of their political opponents, anyone who belonged to, had a career in a party opposed to them, would lose their job in the civil service. And as Jews would lose their jobs in the civil service as well. And so many people counted as civil servants, as state servants, teachers, lawyers, university professors, people in all kinds of walks of life. The state is very large in terms of employment. So a lot of them were very frightened and joined the party to save their skins. But also you have to say that Hitler had a broad appeal, vague phrases, but potent phrases, and delivered with his very often, by this stage managed, but nevertheless very powerful rhetoric. We will rescue Germany, Germany will be great again, we will solve the unemployment, we'll get people back to work, we'll give Germany a good name in the world, we'll revise the Treaty of Versailles. And that had a very broad appeal. So he thought to establish a German empire in Central Eastern Europe would be the way then to essentially to launch Germany as a great world power again. Those are the two key elements of his ideology.
The main things there. When Hitler invaded Poland in '39, starting what became World War II, he was doing fine militarily for a while. But even within his distorted logic, he seems to have committed some actions that still puzzle some people. To begin with, why invade the Soviet Union in 1941 instead of just keeping the deal he had with non-aggression with Stalin? You know, that really started to reverse things for him.
Well, I mean, there's several reasons. First of all, the invasion and conquest of Eastern Europe had been part of his aims from the very outset. This is really what it was about. Invading and conquering France and Western Europe were simply in order to clear the decks for the big operation of Eastern Europe. Secondly, Hitler and the Nazis believed, quite wrongly, but they believed that communism was a Jewish conspiracy, that it had been imposed on the masses in the Soviet Union. They were suffering under this kind of regime, and all it needed was for a few military victories and the whole Stalinist state would crumble. There'd be popular uprisings, and so they thought it would be very easy. That's partly also, of course, because Hitler and his entourage had a deep-seated contempt for Russians. They thought Russians were racially inferior, they couldn't organize a war effort, they couldn't run a country properly.
On racial basis, apart from being communist?
Yes, on a racial basis. It's a deep-seated contempt.
But he decided to do it anyway in '41. He perhaps could have waited longer?
He decided to go, as it were, a little bit earlier than he'd been thinking about in the mid-30s, because he was, I think, dismayed by the British resistance and refusal to capitulate after the defeat of France. And it was one way of getting the British to come to terms was actually by defeating Russia. So Churchill would see there's no hope of fighting on, we've just got to stop. And also Hitler was anxious at various times about his health, particularly in the late 30s. He thought he might die before he got a chance to achieve his aims, so that pulled forward some of the...
The other attack that puzzles some people to this day is, why declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, instead of just leaving the Americans to fight the Japanese in Asia and not having to confront such a strong power at the time? Why did he declare war?
Well, Hitler declared war on the USA in December 1941 for really two reasons. One reason was that the Americans were in fact already in the war. They were already supplying huge quantities of material to the British. They'd been doing so since the spring. They'd signed the Atlantic Charter in the autumn in order to do that. And he knew that America's resources were far greater than Germany's resources, and that this in the longer run would bring about a German defeat. And so he needed to have the opportunity to cut off these transportations of American planes, equipment, ammunitions, tanks, all the rest of it that were coming over from America to Britain, and then starting already to go to the Soviet Union. So America was becoming a major supplier of the Allies. And secondly, he thought the attack on Pearl Harbor was the ideal opportunity to do this, because America will be preoccupied with fighting Japan, would not have the energy, time, attention, resources to come and intervene in Western Europe.
So in other words, it was inevitable, might as well do it now when the Americans seem to be
now is the best time to do it, because they're already in effect already in there.
Germany in the middle, pressed from both sides, and the Americans and their allies on this side, the Russians on that side, two very powerful adversaries. Which one do you think he feared most?
It's difficult to say, really, initially, because he thought of them both as being inferior. He thought America was racially mixed and ineffective and depraved and so on. The Russians are racially inferior and couldn't do anything. But over time, of course, it became clear after the Battle of, already after a while it became clear already by the end of 1941, when the German troops were stopped before Moscow, it could fail to take Moscow, and then overwhelmingly clear at the beginning of 1943, after the forced surrender with tens of thousands of dead of the German troops in Stalingrad, that the Soviet war machine was not going to be defeated. I mean, initially Hitler blamed his generals for doing the wrong thing and being cowardly and not being aggressive enough in their policy, but he soon began to realize by 1943 that the resources of the Soviet Union were also extremely large and very deep, and that as many millions of Russian Soviet troops that were killed or captured, more millions came to take their place.
To try to establish this parallel, you just referred to Stalin as anti-Semitism amongst many other peculiar aspects of his behavior. In retrospect, people look at those two tyrants. There seems to be much more of an acceptance of Stalin. You can even conceive of somebody wearing a Stalin T-shirt and people just laughing about it. Whereas if you wear a Hitler T-shirt, people will attack you. Why the double standard, do you think? That people are trying to compare the two evils?
Well, I think that is changing. I think as more and more has emerged about Stalin and Stalin's rule after the fall of communism in 1990, I think in general our views of Stalin have become much, much more critical. But people still, I think, know, and increasingly know again, that Stalin actually did play the major role in defeating Nazism. And there was, in a way, a kind of positive side to Stalinism, for all one's reservations about the sacrifices that he demanded, but in industrializing Russia and the Soviet Union, building up the Soviet economy. And I think many people still feel that was a great achievement of the Stalinist system. The question, of course, then that immediately poses itself was Stalin and his system really necessary for industrialization? Yeah. And there
Hitler also helped the economy.
There one has to say
Germany.
No. Well, I think Hitler did not really help the economy in Germany, because everything was poured into rearmament with its destructive potential and purposes. Even the famous autobahns, the motorways, actually were meant for military purposes. The very few were built, and they didn't employ very many people. And unemployment was not solved in Germany until conscription in 1935.
He is often described as an evil genius. Well, there's not much discussion about the evil part, but do you think he was a genius of any kind?
I wouldn't call him a genius, no, not at all. No, I mean, he was to some extent lucky. I mean, he only knew, he only knew, two things. You either go for power or it's either or, it's a black and white. He once said, I'm a gambler, I only go for broke. I'll go the furthest I can. It was his good fortune, really, in negotiations over whether he should be appointed Chancellor by these conservatives who wanted to manipulate him in 1932-33, that he steadfastly refused to go into government except as its head. And then later on, again, he'd always sort of move forward, go on to the next thing, and fortune favoured him.
So he gambled and he won.
He gambled and he won until the middle of the war, I guess.
We dealt with Germany internally, but how about outside Germany? People could see that he was violating the terms of the Versailles Treaty, that he was rearming, that he was claiming territory. And people protested a bit, but not much. In general, they let him get away with it, which of course only reinforced his expansionism. In retrospect, should other countries have done something? And more important, could they have done something about it?
Well, I don't think it's a historian's job to tell people in the past what they should have done, as it were. You have to deal with the circumstances of the time. And there was a general feeling among the statesmen and politicians of France and Britain that the Treaty of Versailles, which had taken away territory, 13% of Germany's territory, stopped Germany from having an air force or a navy, restricted the army to 100,000 men, forced Germany to pay financial reparations to the Allies. That was too harsh.
As warned a neighbor of yours in the next building, John Maynard
Keynes, warned the economic consequences of the peace.
Just a few feet away
from us. Yeah, exactly, yeah. And so he, Keynes said this will ruin the German economy, and this is widely believed. More importantly, it was widely believed that Hitler had come to power because of resentment against the peace settlement. And the peace settlement was based on US President Woodrow Wilson's doctrine of self-determination for each nation. In other words, every national group should have its own state. And yet it had been denied. So you had Czechoslovakia, you had Poland, you had Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. All these states had been founded or reorganized. But you did not have this for the Germans. They were not allowed to join in with the German-speaking Austrians. There were millions of German speakers in other parts of Eastern Europe, 2 million in Czechoslovakia, a large number in Poland, and so on. So the Allies
had other leaders to feel that perhaps these claims were not absurd at the time?
No, well, I mean, the other leaders of the Allies felt that if you allowed Germany to revise the Treaty of Versailles in order to incorporate other German-speaking areas, then this would defuse Nazism. It would make Hitler and the Nazis settle down and become, as it were, normal people. And then on top of that, there's a very, very widespread fear of another war, shared incidentally by the great majority of ordinary Germans. They'd seen the death and destruction of the First World War, they'd seen their relatives and their friends die and be killed. They didn't want that again. And in addition to that, there was fear of aerial bombardment. They saw in particular what happened to the town of Guernica in the Basque Country in the Spanish Civil War, 1936, was bombed to pieces. There seemed to be no defense against aerial bombardment. So there's a dislike, fear, and anxiety about war that means that the politicians in Britain, say Neville Chamberlain, were really hamstrung if they wanted to actually take a forward, a more aggressive policy towards Hitler. If they wanted to, let's say, stop the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, they could have done it, but they'd have had no public support. They'd have lost votes, they'd have lost the support of the general public. And the general public only came round to supporting the idea of a war in March 1939 in Britain, when Hitler broke the terms of the Munich Agreement, under which German speakers had been taken away from Czechoslovakia and territory away, and invaded Prague. And then they realized that Hitler was actually not just going to revise a treaty, he was going to try and conquer Europe. That's when people thought war is inevitable, we'll come around, we'll support the idea.
Back to the Germany of today. You know, there's been 65 years since the end of the war. You maintain your links and academic links and study Germany. You go there and you research the country. Do you think the Germans have managed to expurgate that somber past of the Nazi period?
I think on the whole they have. It's very striking, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. That posed the question, what are we? Who are the Germans? They could kind of almost avoid that before then, because they say we're either socialists or we believe in Western democracy. But now there is a single Germany. And the answer they come up with is that what gives Germans identity is a feeling of shared responsibility historically for the crimes of Nazism. So it's very striking that if you go to the capital city, right at the center of it, there's a memorial to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Everywhere you go in Germany, there are memorials. Concentration camps are now being turned into museums. You go around the streets of Hamburg and you can see and let into the pavement a little brass plaques giving the names of the Jews who previously owned the abutting property. You come out of the station, this has been true for many years now, you come out of the underground station at Wittenbergplatz in Berlin, and up there is a huge placard with the names of all the concentration camps, places of terror we must never forget, it says. And so it goes on. I think there's a very strong public memory.
In contrast, for instance, with what the Japanese do.
In contrast to Japan, yes, I think the situation is slowly changing in Japan, but the contrast is still there, and that certainly a lot of people in Japan would rather avoid this question of the Japanese role in the Second World War than confront it. And I do think the Germans have